I found out my husband was a stranger 3 weeks after his heart stopped. And the person holding the knife was the woman I called Mom. I'm sitting in a courtroom right now watching the woman who raised me go to prison, all because of a secret my husband kept for 10 years. Grab a drink and settle in because this story is a rabbit hole you won't believe. My husband, Mark, was the kind of man that made other women jealous of me. We lived in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. Mark was a star architect. I was a freelance editor. We were the golden couple. Mark was the man who remembered the exact brand of tea I liked. The man who would drive 40 miles in the rain just to get me the specific headache medicine I preferred. We had a ritual every Sunday. He'd cook blueberry pancakes, we'd read the paper, and we'd talk about the future. "One day, Sarah," he'd say, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, "this house is going to be filled with the sound of kids running around. I promise you." But that promise was a haunting one. For 3 years, we tried everything: IVF, specialists, holistic doctors. We spent $40,000. And I'll never forget the night he came home from the clinic, his face as white as a sheet. He told me he was sterile. He sat on the floor of our kitchen and sobbed into my lap, telling me he felt like half a man. I held him. I told him I didn't care about the kids. I only cared about him. How was I supposed to know that every tear he shed that night was a lie? On a Tuesday in October, Mark went for his morning jog. He never came back. A pulmonary embolism. A blood clot that hit his lungs. Just like that, the man I built my life around was a body in a morgue. The weeks after the funeral were a gray fog. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. The only person who kept me tethered to reality was his mother, Evelyn. Evelyn was old money. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to breakfast and looked at my middle-class upbringing with a polite, hidden disdain. But in my grief, she changed. She was at my house every single morning at 7 a.m. She would clean, she would cook, and most importantly, she took over the paperwork. "Sarah, darling, you can't be expected to handle the estate," she whispered one afternoon while I sat staring at a blank wall. "The bills, the life insurance, the legalities. It's too much for a grieving heart. Let me handle the mail. I'll bring you only what you need to sign." I trusted her. She was my mother-in-law. I thought she was protecting me. I didn't realize she was building a wall around the truth. The turning point happened 22 days after the funeral. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs at 5 a.m. to get some water. I heard a noise in the kitchen, the sound of paper tearing. I stood in the doorway and watched Evelyn. She wasn't the grieving grandmother. She was frantic. She was standing over a pile of Mark's mail, and she was shoving a thick, yellow legal envelope into the hidden lining of her designer handbag. "Evelyn," I whispered. She didn't jump. She was a professional. She slowly turned around, smoothed her skirt, and smiled. "Sarah, you're up early. I was just clearing out some junk mail. Advertisements, credit card offers. I didn't want them cluttering your mind." "What was in the yellow envelope?" I asked. My voice felt stronger than it had in weeks. "Nothing, dear. Just some old tax records from Mark's firm. Boring, dusty things. Go back to bed." She left an hour later, but that yellow envelope stayed in my mind. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I waited until Evelyn was asleep in the guest room, drunk on the expensive sherry she'd been using to calm her nerves, and I went through her bag. I found it. It wasn't tax records. It was a life insurance policy for $500,000 and a copy of a will Mark had signed only 6 months before he died. A will Evelyn had told me didn't exist. I opened it, expecting to see my name, and I did, but I saw another name too. 50% of all liquid assets to my wife, Sarah Miller. 50% to be held in an irrevocable trust for the care and education of my daughter, Chloe Miller. My heart stopped. I read it again and again. My daughter, Chloe Miller. We didn't have a daughter. Mark was sterile, so who was Chloe? I looked further into the envelope and found a secondary address. 142 Oak Creek Drive, Chattanooga. I didn't wake Evelyn up. I didn't scream. I grabbed my keys, got into my SUV, and drove 2 hours south to Chattanooga. I arrived as the sun was coming up. The address wasn't a hidden mansion. It was a Section 8 apartment complex. Peeling paint, broken glass in the parking lot, the smell of exhaust and old trash. It was the polar opposite of the life Mark had built with me. I walked up to door 4B. My hand was shaking so hard, I had to use both hands to knock. A woman answered. She looked like she hadn't slept in years. She was wearing faded nursing scrubs and holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm Sarah," I said. "I'm Mark Miller's wife." The woman, Elena, didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. She stepped aside and said, "I figured his mother would try to keep you away forever. Come in." I walked into a tiny, cramped living room filled with toys. And there, sitting on a threadbare rug, was a 7-year-old girl. She looked exactly like Mark. She had his messy brown hair, his lopsided grin, and most hauntingly, those ice blue eyes that I used to wake up to every morning. "That's Chloe," Elena said softly. For the next 4 hours, the world I knew was systematically dismantled. Elena and Mark were high school sweethearts. Evelyn had forced them apart because Elena wasn't the right pedigree. She had threatened to disinherit Mark if he ever stayed with her. So Mark did what a coward does. He married the acceptable girl, me. He built the acceptable life. But for 10 years, he had been living a double life. Every late night at the office, every weekend business trip to Nashville, he was here. He was being a father to Chloe. "He loved you, Sarah," Elena said, her eyes filling with tears. "He told me you were the best woman he'd ever met. But he was terrified of his mother. She controlled the family estate, and he wanted that money to secure Chloe's future. He was waiting for the right time to tell you, but the right time never came." Then came the final crushing blow. Chloe was sick. She had a congenital heart defect, the same genetic condition that had just killed Mark. She needed a valve replacement that cost over $100,000. Mark had signed that new will because he knew he was having chest pains. He was trying to save her before he ran out of time. I drove back to Oak Ridge in a state of cold, crystalline rage. When I walked into my kitchen, Evelyn was sitting there, her silver tea service laid out perfectly. "You've been out, Sarah," she said, her voice sharp. "The neighbors saw your car leave at 4 a.m. It's not a good look for a widow to be roaming the streets at night." I didn't say a word. I walked over and dropped the photos of the will and a photo I'd taken of Chloe onto the table. Evelyn didn't even flinch. She took a slow sip of her tea, set the cup down with a quiet clink, and looked at me with eyes like a cobra. "So you found the lapse in judgment," she said smoothly. "Mark was a young man with needs, Sarah. That girl is a mistake, a smudge on the family name. If that will goes to probate, the scandal will ruin Mark's memory. Do you want the world to know your perfect husband was a liar? Do you want to be the woman everyone pities at the grocery store?" "I don't care about the neighbors, Evelyn," I hissed. "She's his daughter. She's dying. And you were going to let her die just to keep your pedigree clean." "She is a stranger," Evelyn snapped, slamming her hand on the table. "Listen to me. You signed the papers I've prepared stating no will was found. We split the insurance. You moved to Knoxville. You live in luxury, and we never speak of this again. Or you can fight me. I have the best lawyers in the state. I will tie this up for a decade. By the time that bastard sees a dime, she'll be under the ground. Choose, Sarah, be a comfortable widow or a penniless martyr." I looked at the woman who had been my mother for a decade, and I realized that Mark hadn't just lied to me. He had been a victim of this woman's poison his entire life. "You're right, Evelyn," I said. "People will talk, but they won't be talking about me." I didn't sign her papers. I went to the police and the State Bar Association. It turns out, Evelyn had been intercepting Mark's legal mail for weeks. That's mail fraud. She had also attempted to bribe me to destroy a legal document. The trial was the biggest scandal Oak Ridge had seen in 50 years. The Golden family was stripped bare. The news called it the inheritance of silence. Evelyn's high society friends vanished overnight. She was eventually sentenced to 3 years for tampering with a legal estate and mail fraud. She lost her house, her reputation, and her mind. Last I heard, she's in a facility, still telling the nurses she's the Queen of Tennessee. As for me, I sold the big Craftsman house. I moved to a small place near Chattanooga. I'm not a penniless martyr. I'm the woman who made sure Chloe got her surgery. I see her every weekend now. When she laughs, I still see Mark. And for a long time, that hurt. It hurt to look at the living proof of his betrayal. But then I realized, Chloe didn't ask for any of this. She's not the betrayal. She's the only part of Mark that was actually real. They say that grief is the price we pay for love. But what do you call the price you pay for a lie? I spent 10 years sleeping next to a man who carried a whole other world in his chest. A man who looked me in the eye while I cried over negative pregnancy tests, knowing all along that his heart was walking around in another city. For a long time, I hated him. I hated every I love you, every anniversary gift, every memory we built, because I knew it was all bought with the currency of silence. But then I look at Chloe. I see her running in the park with a heart that works. I see those ice blue eyes, and for a split second, I don't see a betrayal. I see a chance. Mark wasn't a villain, and he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who let his mother's shadow grow longer than his own soul. And Evelyn? She thought she could bury the truth under tea sets and designer bags, but she forgot that the truth is like a seed. The more dirt you pile on top of it, the harder it fights to reach the light. My marriage ended twice, once at a funeral and once at door 4B. I'm starting over now with something better than a fresh start. I'm starting over with the truth, and in the end, that's the only inheritance worth keeping.